Deep within the Amazon rainforest, 1,000 miles from the ocean, stands a monument to an impossible history. A European palace, crafted from Italian marble and Scottish steel, rises from the jungle. It is called the Teatro Amazonas, the Amazon Theater. The official story tells us it was built by rubber barons, men of immense wealth and ambition, who wished to bring Parisian culture to the heart of the world's most unforgiving wilderness. They tell us this was a feat of human will, a testament to the power of commerce. But this story, the one repeated in guidebooks and documentaries, has a fundamental problem. When you look past the romance and examine the logistics, the numbers, and the records, the story falls apart. It is not simply improbable. It is impossible. The weight of the materials, the technology required, the specialized labor force needed to assemble such a structure in such a location, none of it aligns with the documented reality of the 19th century. We are told a story of ambition. But the evidence points to a story of deception. In this investigation, we will not speculate on who truly built this structure. We will instead prove, using simple logic and the official record itself, that the accepted narrative is a fabrication. The evidence does not show us who built it, but it proves, conclusively, that they did not. To understand the scale of the anomaly, you must first understand the location. This is Manaus, Brazil. A city carved directly from the jungle, situated at the confluence of the Rio Negro and the Solomos rivers. In the late 19th century, it was an outpost, a remote settlement accessible only by water. To get there from the Atlantic, one had to navigate 1,000 miles of the treacherous, winding Amazon River. It was, for all intents and purposes, an island in a vast, green sea. And yet, here, in this isolated place, stands the Teatro Amazonas. It does not belong. It is a structure of radical, defiant incongruity. Look at the facade. Those columns are not local stone. They are Carrara marble, quarried in the mountains of Tuscany, Italy, over 5,000 miles away. The ornate roof is covered in 36,000 tiles, painted in the colors of the Brazilian flag, imported from Alsace, a region disputed between France and Germany. The grand dome that crowns the building is framed with steel beams forged in Glasgow, Scotland. Inside, the opulence is staggering. The chandeliers are made from Murano glass, crafted on an island in a Venetian lagoon. The curtains were woven in Paris. The staircases, the balconies, the balustrades, all Italian marble. The building is a catalogue of Europe's finest luxury goods, assembled piece by piece in a location that had no industrial base, no tradition of classical architecture, and no means of producing these materials locally. How, exactly, did it get here? This is not a question of wealth. The rubber barons were rich, to be sure. But wealth does not suspend the laws of physics. It does not shorten distances. It does not create infrastructure where none exists. Every single piece of this building, from the multi-ton steel girders to the delicate glass chandeliers, had to be carefully packed, loaded onto a steamship in a European port, survive a month-long transatlantic crossing, be offloaded in a Brazilian coastal city like Belém, then reloaded onto smaller river vessels capable of making the 1,000-mile journey inland. Each step of this process presents a series of profound logistical challenges that the official narrative simply glosses over. The building stands as a visual contradiction. Its very presence challenges the environment around it. How does a structure built with materials so unsuited for a tropical climate, heavy stone that sinks into soft soil, iron that rusts in extreme humidity, stand so perfectly preserved for over a century? The building is not just out of place stylistically. It seems to be out of place technologically. It is too perfect, too pristine. It looks less like a building constructed on site and more like a thing that arrived, fully formed. The anomaly is not just the building itself, but the stark, undeniable chasm between what we see with our own eyes and what we are told is possible. Let us consider the practical steps. Not as a romantic story of ambition, but as a cold, logistical problem. The problem is one of mass and distance. Official sources state that over 12,000 tons of material were imported from Europe. Let us begin with the first and most basic element, the stone. Blocks of Carrara marble, some weighing several tons apiece. First, they must be quarried from the mountains of Italy. Then transported to a port like Genoa. This itself is a major undertaking. But the journey has just begun. The marble must be loaded onto a transatlantic steamship. In the 1880s, the average cargo ship was a vessel of modest capacity. Transporting thousands of tons of delicate, heavy stone across the Atlantic would have required a fleet of ships, or dozens of dedicated journeys. Each journey was a gamble against the harsh conditions of the open ocean. Now, imagine the cargo arrives at the mouth of the Amazon. The ocean-going vessels that crossed the Atlantic were too large, with too deep a draft, to navigate 1,000 miles upriver. So everything must be unloaded. The multi-ton blocks of marble, the steel beams, the tens of thousands of roof tiles, the fragile crates of glass. They must be moved from one ship to another. What machinery was used for this transfer? What port facilities existed in Belém at that time capable of handling this volume and weight of cargo? The records are thin. Now begins the most perilous leg of the journey, the 1,000-mile trip to Manaus. The cargo must be loaded onto smaller river steamers or barges. These vessels have a fraction of the capacity of their ocean-going counterparts. They must fight the river's powerful current, navigate its shifting sandbars, and endure the oppressive heat and humidity. How does one load a 5-ton block of marble onto a river barge in the 1880s? How is it kept stable for a journey that would take weeks? This process would have to be repeated, over and over, for more than a decade. A constant, unbroken chain of transport, moving a mountain of Europe, piece by piece, into the jungle. And transport is only the first impossibility. What of the labor? A structure of this complexity requires a very specific set of skills. Not just general laborers, but expert stonemasons, structural engineers, ironworkers, glazers, and artisans. Where did these people come from? The official story says they were brought from Europe. Imagine the recruitment effort. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Europe's finest craftsmen convinced to leave their homes and travel to a remote, disease-ridden outpost for a decade-long project. Where were they housed in Manaus? A city that, at the time, was largely comprised of wooden shacks. Building the housing, sanitation, and medical facilities for this migrant army would have been a construction project on the same scale as the theater itself. There is no record of this phantom city. There is no mention in the census data of a sudden, massive influx of European tradesmen. Who fed them? How were they supplied? The official story is silent on these questions. Finally, there is the impossibility of technology. Look at the steel dome. Assembling a curved, load-bearing steel structure requires precise calculations and heavy lifting equipment. What cranes were used? Steam-powered cranes existed, but they were monstrously heavy machines. Did they transport a crane, in pieces, up the Amazon as well? And then assemble it on site with what equipment? How were the foundations laid? The Amazon basin is essentially soft, shifting soil. A 12,000-ton stone and steel building requires deep, stable foundations to avoid sinking or cracking. The engineering required to achieve this in a rainforest environment would be challenging even for modern engineers. For the 1880s, it is a miracle. A miracle for which no technical plans or engineering studies exist. The entire narrative rests on the idea that unprecedented wealth can solve unprecedented problems. But it cannot. Money cannot create technology that does not exist in a region. It cannot conjure a skilled workforce out of thin air. The story asks us to believe in a series of logistical impossibilities, one after the other, without providing a single piece of concrete evidence to show how they were overcome. When faced with such profound logistical questions, we must turn to the official record. We must look for the blueprints, the shipping manifests, the payrolls, the project plans. This is where the narrative dissolves from improbable to unsubstantiated. The story we are given is built not on documents, but on romantic folklore. The story of the rubber barons. We are told these men, enriched by the global demand for rubber, simply willed the opera house into existence. It is a compelling narrative. It captures the spirit of the Gilded Age, of powerful industrialists reshaping the world in their image. But it is a story that serves to distract from the complete lack of verifiable evidence. Where are the shipping logs? For a project that allegedly involved the transport of 12,000 tons of material across the Atlantic and up the Amazon, there should be a vast and detailed paper trail. We should have access to hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of manifests from shipping companies in Glasgow, Genoa, and Hamburg. We should be able to see itemized lists. Crate 74, 100 Alsatian roof tiles. Pallet 12, 1 class a marble column. Dimensions X by Y bill of lading for 50 steel girders. This documentation does not exist in any public archive. What we have are vague summary accounts, post hoc newspaper articles celebrating the achievement, but not the raw, boring, logistical data that a project of this magnitude would have inevitably generated. Where are the architectural and engineering plans? We have conceptual drawings, beautiful artistic renderings of what the building would look like. We do not have the structural blueprints. We do not have the engineering calculations for the dome's load-bearing capacity or the schematics for the foundation. How can you build a complex, multi-story steel and stone structure without a detailed set of technical instructions? It is not possible. Yet, the very documents that would prove how it was done are missing. Consider the workforce. If thousands of European specialists were employed for over a decade, there would be records. Payroll ledgers, immigration documents, housing permits, worker contracts. Census records for Manaus between 1884 and 1896 should show a demographic anomaly, a sudden, sustained surge in the population of European males aged 20 to 50. The data is either missing or shows no such anomaly. It's as if an army of ghosts built the theater. The official timeline itself is another failure of logic. Construction officially began in 1884 and was completed in 1896. 12 years. At first, this sounds like a long time. But when you factor in the 4 to 5 years we calculated would be required for river transport alone, assuming a non-stop dedicated logistics chain, the timeline becomes impossibly compressed. This leaves only a few years for transatlantic shipping, quarrying, manufacturing, and the actual on-site construction of one of the most complex buildings of its era. Every single attempt to verify the official story leads to a dead end. A missing file. A vague account. A story that is repeated, but never substantiated. The official history of the Teatro Amazonas is an empty vessel. It is a narrative framework with no supporting structure. It is a story designed to be accepted, not investigated. If the Teatro Amazonas were an isolated incident, we might be forced to accept it as a one-time historical miracle, a strange fluke of history where all the impossibilities somehow resolved themselves. But it is not an isolated incident. When you look, you begin to see a pattern, a global template of anomalous structures appearing in remote locations, each with its own convenient but logically flawed cover story. Consider the Palacio de Hierro, the Iron Palace, in Orizaba, Mexico. A towering, elegant structure made entirely of prefabricated iron and steel, designed by the firm of Gustave Eiffel. The official story is that it was manufactured in Belgium in 1892, disassembled, packed into crates, shipped across the Atlantic, hauled inland to a high-altitude mountain city, and reassembled by local workers. The parallels are striking. The importation of massive quantities of advanced European materials. The logistical nightmare of transport to a remote, non-industrialized location. The reliance on a local workforce that supposedly learned complex, specialized engineering skills on the fly. And just like in Manaus, the detailed shipping and assembly records are sparse, replaced by a romantic story of a wealthy mayor's ambition. Now let's travel across the world, to Iquitos, Peru. Another rubber boom city, even more remote than Manaus, situated deep in the Peruvian Amazon. There, you will find the Casa de Fierro, the Iron House. Another structure designed by Eiffel's firm. And another identical story, prefabricated in Europe, shipped in pieces across the ocean, then hauled hundreds of miles up the Amazon. Another logistical miracle in the jungle, attributed to the wealth of rubber barons. The same story, in a different location. Is this a coincidence? Or a template? The pattern extends beyond these Eiffel structures. Look at the city of Sucre, Bolivia. At an altitude of over 9,000 feet in the Andes Mountains, we find La Recoleta Monastery, a complex of pristine, European-style courtyards and colonnades. Or look at the Municipal Theater of Santiago, Chile, a near-perfect replica of a Parisian opera house, completed in 1857. At a time when Chile was a relatively isolated and developing nation. How were these massive, complex stone structures built with such precision in locations so far removed from the centers of their architectural origin? The answer is always the same: wealthy patrons, European architects, and heroic effort. The explanation is always focused on motive, the desire to imitate Europe, while completely ignoring the question of means. These buildings are treated as cultural artifacts, but they should be viewed as industrial and logistical artifacts. And when viewed that way, they make no sense in their given contexts. This pattern is not random. It is a recurring motif. A European-style palace appears in the jungle. A cast-iron mansion appears on a mountainside. A grand theater appears in a colonial outpost. The architecture is always foreign. The materials are always imported. The logistics are always borderline impossible. And the official records are always conveniently incomplete. The Teatro Amazonas is not a unique anomaly. It is the most striking example of a global phenomenon. A phenomenon that suggests a coordinated, standardized effort to place specific types of structures in specific types of locations, using a logistical capability that has been written out of our history. Stories can be manipulated. Records can be lost, but numbers, when examined with cold logic, do not lie. Let's return to the core of the problem, the 12,000 tons of material. For the sake of caution, let us reduce this figure. Let us say it was only 10,000 tons. Now, let's walk through the math, step by step. We begin with the transatlantic crossing. A typical cargo steamship of the 1880s, like the SS Aberdeen, had a gross tonnage of around 4,000 tons, but its actual cargo capacity, what it could carry, was closer to 2,500 tons. This capacity was not for a single client. It was shared among dozens of exporters. Let's be generous and assume the theater project could secure 500 tons of dedicated space on each vessel leaving Europe for Brazil. A simple calculation: 10,000 tons of material divided by 500 tons per ship. This requires 20 separate transatlantic voyages. 20 fully loaded ships, all dedicated to one single construction project in a remote jungle city. This is already a massive industrial undertaking. But the journey is not over. Now, the material must travel 1,000 miles up the Amazon River. The vessels capable of this journey were not ocean liners. They were smaller, shallower river steamers. Their cargo capacity for heavy, dense materials like stone and steel would be severely limited. A generous estimate might be 150 tons per vessel. So, we take our 10,000 tons of material and divide it by 150 tons per river barge. The result is 66.6. Let us call it 67 separate river journeys. Each one of these journeys is a 2,000-mile round trip. Against the Amazon's current, a steamer might average 5 miles per hour. The upstream leg alone, 1,000 miles, would take 200 hours of continuous, non-stop travel. That is over 8 days. The return trip would be faster. Let's say the entire round trip, including loading and unloading, takes a bare minimum of 3 weeks. Now, multiply that. 67 trips, each taking 3 weeks. The total time spent just on river transport is 201 weeks. That is 3 years and 10 months. This calculation assumes perfect efficiency. It assumes there is a dedicated fleet of river steamers running back and forth in a continuous loop, with no delays, no accidents, no seasonal changes in water level halting traffic, and no other cargo being prioritized. 4 years. This is nearly 1/3 of the entire official construction period, spent on just one leg of the transportation. This 4-year period does not account for the time it took to quarry the marble in Italy, ship it to the coast, and wait for a transatlantic vessel. It does not account for the months spent at sea. It does not account for the time spent manufacturing steel in Scotland or tiles in France. When you add these factors, the logistical timeline consumes the entire 12-year construction window, leaving no time for the actual construction. And what of the workforce? Let's use conservative numbers again. A project of this complexity would need a core team of at least 200 skilled artisans, masons, engineers, metalworkers. It would also require a support team and unskilled labor force of at least twice that number. Let's say 600 workers in total, on site for 10 years. A city like Manaus in the 1880s had a population of a few thousand people. An influx of 600 foreign workers would increase the population by a significant percentage overnight. These 600 men need to be fed 3 meals a day. That's 1,800 meals per day. Over 650,000 meals per year. Where did this food come from? Was it all shipped up the same, already overburdened river? The numbers reveal a hidden, secondary logistical problem. Supporting the workforce would require a supply chain almost as complex as the one for the building materials. The official story accounts for none of this. The numbers do not just suggest difficulty. They scream impossibility. The evidence has shown us that the official narrative is not a viable explanation. The visual, practical, and numerical analysis all point to a single conclusion. The story of the rubber barons building the Teatro Amazonas is a fabrication. So, we are left with a building that should not exist, but does. This requires a hypothesis. Not one of fantasy or speculation, but a controlled hypothesis that fits the facts as they have been presented. The hypothesis is this: the Teatro Amazonas, and the other structures in its global pattern, were not the products of private, commercial ambition. They were the products of a coordinated, technologically advanced, and clandestine organization operating on a global scale. This was not a public works project. It was a covert operation. Let us examine how this hypothesis solves the problems we have identified. First, the problem of logistics. The official story fails because it is constrained by the publicly known technology and infrastructure of the 19th century. But what if the builders were not so constrained? What if they possessed a logistical network, perhaps more advanced ships, better transport methods, or simply a ruthlessly efficient, centrally planned supply chain? That was unknown to the public. A network of this nature could move 12,000 tons of material with a speed and efficiency that would seem impossible to outside observers. Second, the problem of the missing records. If this were a clandestine operation, the last thing it would want is a paper trail. The lack of manifests, blueprints, and payrolls is not evidence of poor record keeping. It is evidence of excellent operational security. The records are not missing, they were never meant to exist in any public archive. They were kept within the organization, and they remain there. Third, the problem of the global pattern. The striking similarities between anomalous structures around the world cease to be a coincidence. They become evidence of a standardized building program. This organization was not just building an opera house in Manaus. It was deploying assets, executing a template. The Palacio de Hierro, the Casa de Fierro, these were not separate, unrelated projects. They were part of the same global initiative. The purpose of this initiative remains unknown. Were these buildings cultural embassies? Administrative outposts for a shadow government? Were they functional in a way we don't understand, their ornate designs perhaps concealing a technological purpose? We do not have the data to say. But the hypothesis of a coordinated, advanced organization provides a framework that explains the evidence. The rubber boom was not the cause of the construction. It was the perfect cover story. The sudden influx of wealth and population into Manaus created a chaotic environment, a state of exception where a massive construction project could proceed without raising too many questions. The project was hidden in plain sight. Its expenses were laundered through the booming local economy. And when it was complete, the keys, and a convenient, heroic story, were handed over to the local elites. The rubber barons did not build the Teatro Amazonas. They were simply the first owners, chosen to legitimize the building's presence and obscure its true origins. They likely did not even know the full story themselves. They were merely the beneficiaries of a project whose scale and purpose was far beyond their comprehension. We are left with a profound contradiction. A building of impossible elegance, born from an impossible logistical chain, explained by an impossible story. The Teatro Amazonas stands today not as a monument to the ambition of rubber barons, but as a silent testament to a history that has been deliberately obscured. The official narrative fails every test we apply to it. The visual evidence shows a structure at war with its environment. The practical requirements of transport and labor defy the known capabilities of the era. The numbers do not add up. The paper trail leads nowhere. And the pattern repeats itself across the globe. We are conditioned to accept the histories we are given. We are told that our ancestors, through sheer force of will, accomplished incredible things. And they did. But this is not one of those stories. This is a story of concealment. The question we must ask is not how did they do it? The evidence shows they did not. The real question is, why was this story invented? What larger truth does this fabrication serve to protect? What capabilities are being hidden from us, written off as the romantic excesses of a bygone age? These buildings are not just architecture. They are anomalies. They are data points that suggest our understanding of the recent past is incomplete. They sit in plain sight, in the centers of our cities, waiting. They challenge us to stop accepting the stories and to start questioning the evidence before our very eyes. The patterns are there, for those willing to see them. Look at the foundations of your own cities. Question the official timelines. The truth is not buried in forgotten archives. It is carved in stone and cast in iron, waiting for you to simply observe. If you wish to continue this investigation, consider following our work. The archive is always open.